Welcome back, guys. It is Bible Scribe. Thank you again for joining me. Christian pacifism, turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, doing good to those who hate you. This topic was given to me suggested by one of my listeners, and he said in the comment that he thought it would be controversial, and I do think that is the case. But I ain't scared, so let's try this. We're going to do this topic and talk about whether a Christian should ever fight, whether a Christian should ever be violent, and how does that jive with what Christ taught when he was on earth, and with the testimony of God's hand in history. We will at least touch on both those things, but I think it's important for us to talk about this as Christians. Because it is important the way that the world around us sees who we are and what we do. And, people with a cursory understanding of the scriptures remember pieces and snippets of what Christ may have said. And so we just have to be aware that we're being watched. So it's important for us to understand this topic and know how each of us, understand and believe that we should act in front of others according to Christ's teachings and what that all means. So let's get into this. We're going to start just by reading the most normative traditional text on Christ's teaching about loving your enemies, and that is in Matthew chapter 5 verse 38 is where we're going to start. Let me bring it up for you. And we're just going to read about 5 or 6 verses here where Christ is talking specifically about this. And this is what everyone talks about. As soon as you mention Christian pacifism, or, do Christians ever fight or do violence, or is it wrong, is it right? They go to these verses first because this is the most clear, direct teaching Christ gave on the subject. So in Matthew 5, verse 38, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, resist not evil, but whoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. You have heard it has been said, you shall love your enemy, or love your neighbor, and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which persecute you. That ye may be children of your Father which is in heaven, for he maketh the sun rise on the evil and the good, and sendeth the rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those which love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the publicans have the same? And if you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the publicans do this? Be ye therefore perfect, as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." So, this is the de facto standard teaching from Jesus Christ, Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 48, and we just read that together. So, we've all probably heard those verses before. So we're going to dig a little deeper, and most of us have had some level of teaching on these verses in this topic. It's not an unpopular topic, but I think it is kind of controversial because I think what mostly happens is that each Christian tends to come up with their own version of this, and what does it mean to them and how they should live it out, which is, I don't think, necessarily wrong, as long as we are getting as close as we can to what Christ taught and meant for us in our lives and what is appropriate with God. So let's go over to my notes. Should Christians ever fight? Should we do violence? And here are all my, I looked through all these links while I was studying, but we're not going to go through all those, but I'll put them in the description for you. So this statement in Matthew chapter 5, where he says an eye for an eye. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, this comes straight out of the Old Testament. And so it's important for us to know exactly what that meant. And this is in Exodus chapter 21, verse 22 through 25. It says, "Suppose two men are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, causing the baby to come out or be born prematurely. If there is no further injury, the man who caused the accident must pay money, whatever amount the woman's husband says and the court allows." So in this case, a man gets into a fight with a woman or another man, and they hit a woman who's pregnant. She miscarries the baby dies. What do? And it's up to the father of the baby, really, in this case. It goes on to say, "But if there is further injury, then the punishment that must be paid is the life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise." So it almost sounds like in Exodus chapter 21 that in the case of injury incurred from one man to another, either by fighting or by, an accident or however it may happen, that it's kind of a general understanding that it needs to be paid back. And the Jews actually throughout history, and even in modern times, when you talk to them about how they teach their children, they have a strong emphasis on making up for your shortcomings or the things you've slighted other people in, paying them back and making up for those things. And so this is the part of the genesis of those ideas with the Jewish people. And it is that just this eye for eye kind of mentality that if you slight someone in some way, then you must repay them in an equivalent way to the slight. And so in the case of the law or the ruling it's talking about in this verse, it is a match for match. If it's a burn, it's a burn. If it's an eye, tooth for tooth, an equivalent recompense. So then in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 19 through 22, it says, "Whoever causes an injury to a neighbor must receive the same kind of injury in return, broken bone for broken bone, eye for eye, tooth for tooth." It reiterates the same idea. And again, so this kind of making up for what you have slighted the other person in an equivalent way is the way that the law handled that in Moses' time in the Mosaic Law for the Jews and the Israelites. Leviticus 24, verse 17 says, "Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death himself." So life for life, just like it said in the previous verses. So now that we have that understanding, it gives us more information as to what we read in Matthew. So let's go ahead and talk about turning the other cheek. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 30 says, "He gives his cheek to him that smites him. He is filled full with reproach." Now, when I started studying this, I didn't realize that this cheek for cheek, or turning the other cheek, idea was in the Old Testament, but it is. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 30. It's saying that if you can, instead of taking vengeance because of being slighted, and this is truly about being slighted or slapped on the face. It's not this particular thing, turning the other cheek, it's about an insult. And a slap to the face was an insult. And it says that if you instead turn the other cheek in the case of being slighted and insulted, then the person who did it will be filled with reproach. Like it angers the person more if you don't take revenge in that case of an insult than if you do, almost as if you would be validating them by responding at all. And so this is really, I think, for us, helping us understand the meaning of turning the other cheek a little better. Now, I got this paragraph off of a site. It says about the slap that Jesus says we should endure, and that's what it is, the smite on the cheek. It's Jesus here speaks, it says, of personal slights of any kind. The slap or the smiting does not have to involve literal physical violence. Even in our day, a slap in the face is a metaphor for an unexpected insult or offense. Did someone insult you? Then let him, Jesus says. Are you shocked and offended? Don't be. And don't return insult for insult. Turn the other cheek. So I like the way this website explains it because it's absolutely right. in the way Jesus was saying, turn the other cheek, it was meant for when you're being insulted. If you sustain, minor injury or whatever, this is an insult kind of offense. It's like a slap on the cheek. It's a public humiliation. It is all those things. And Jesus is saying, don't let that cause you to exact vengeance. Instead, take it, swallow it, and stand your ground, and it will be more effective against the person who gave it than trying to retaliate with them. And so it goes on, it says, turning the other cheek does not mean we place ourselves or others in danger. Jesus commands simply to forgo retaliation for personal offense. He was not setting government foreign policy, and he was not throwing out the judicial system. Crimes can still be prosecuted and wars waged, but the follower of Christ need not defend his personal rights or avenge his honor. That's going a little further than I want to go right now, but, I like the first paragraph better, but it is making a good point. This is not a reference to particulars about the way governments should behave or the way wars should or should not be waged or how the judicial system works. This is simply telling you how to handle a person who's trying to humiliate you and offend you and intentionally put you down in front of other people. I went to a Jewish website and it says, the evil person whom we are not to resist is not a foreign power or a dictator or an armed home intruder. It's a person in our community who has offended or humiliated us. So again, they, from a Jewish perspective, modern Jewish perspective, mind you, they agree with this statement that this idea, even in Lamentations in the Old Testament, of turning the other cheek is one of how to thwart a person who is trying to humiliate or trying to slight you in public or slander you. And it's just to not retaliate in the case of that, so that in turn their whole humiliation is made null, essentially. And it makes them more, upset than if you actually had tried to fight back. So just a note that Jews, even in the modern time, and I go there a lot with some of my study that involves Jewish ideas and ancient Jewish ideas, because their system of judicial and the way they handle things like this, it hasn't really changed that much over the centuries. And so I always like to kind of see what do modern Jews think about it, because it's usually very often close or rooted in what the Old Testament says still, because they do hold to the Old Testament teachings still so closely, depending on the sect or group of Jews you're talking about in modern day. Another thing, let's see, there were problems in the time when Christ was speaking this in Matthew chapter 5 with the abuse of the law. Let's recognize this also. The Pharisees had added hundreds of laws to the Mosaic law, little nitpicky things, and the Jews would litigate against each other for the smallest of things. And they found, even though I think in the Old Testament it teaches that that's wrong, to the Israelites weren't supposed to bring each other to, sue each other per se, but they did. And the Pharisees and Sadducees, they had woven so much little nitpicky stuff throughout the law and added so much that they were now able to get around some of those teachings, and they allowed people to do these things. And the law system was very abused in the time of Christ. And so I think it also speaks, some of what Christ is talking to them about is exactly that. He even says, don't bring litigation against your neighbor, I believe. Let me see where it says. Well, I thought I read it. Sue thee, yes. If any man sues you and takes your coat, let him have your cloak also. So, again, just relating the things, because at this time the law was very corrupt, and people were, suing all over the place for different small things, minor infractions of the law and things like that. And Christ is saying, the way to diffuse all that and stop that madness is just don't retaliate. If the guy wants your cloak and it's going to cause a ruckus, give him your cloak, and give him your coat also, or whatever. And just in that way you diffuse your enemies. And these nonsensical arguments and back and forths and humiliations and slanders, they just go away. Now, this phrase, love your enemies, we saw that also as we read, but Matthew 44, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. So, this is echoed in a few places. One of them is Romans chapter 12, and it says in verse 17, recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it's possible, as much lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Note that if it is possible. Just note that he gave an out. He said, do your best to live peaceably with all men, if it is at all possible. All right. So just realize that even Paul was somewhat recognizing that there were cases by saying this. He implies that there are cases where you are not able to live peaceably with all men. All right. Verse 19, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So again, vengeance doesn't have to be taken. The Lord can repay that, and it said, he has said, vengeance is mine, and that's in the other parts of the scripture. Therefore, if thine enemy is hungry, feed him. If he thirsts, give him a drink, for in so doing you shall heap coals of fire on his head. Again, this is instructions for how to diffuse an enemy. Do not be overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. So these are definitely strategies for overcoming evil, people coming against you. If at all possible, being peaceable with all men and not avenging yourself in the sight of men. Proverbs 20 verse 22 says, do not say, I'll pay you back for this wrong. Wait for the Lord, he will avenge you. Again, echoing that same statement that God can avenge you and will avenge you in the end. And I think the timetable on that is key. God has his own timetable. We have ours. But just note that is said a few times in Scripture. Do not avenge yourself, because God will avenge you. 1 Thessalonians 5:15 says, make sure nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but strives to do what is good for each other and everyone else. So try to make the best decision, strive to do what's good for each other, and don't pay back wrong for wrong. So don't do something bad to someone just because they did something bad to you, necessarily. 1 Peter 3:8-11, finally, all of you be like-minded, sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. Now, I just realized and recognized that I meant to say something, that is, in these New Testament passages like Thessalonians, 1 Peter, note that this is talking to groups of Christians. And so I'm not saying it completely means only dealings between Christians, but that could be a primary focus of these passages, because Peter's writing was to Christians, and the Thessalonians was Paul's writing to the Thessalonican Christians. And so these are about, if I had to make a statement, and then I need to go back to these passages and probably read the context, but I would say that probably a primary focus of these passages is these Christians' dealings with one another. I know that, I always harp on people because that verse, love is, by your love, they will know that you are mine, says Jesus. And so the writing, though, that is in and where it's placed and who's it's said to is Christians. It's saying that Christians, by their love for one another, will show the world whose they are, whose children they are. Not by Christians going out and loving other people outside the church necessarily. Not that they shouldn't, but that's not what that passage is talking about. It's talking about Christians' brotherly love for one another. That's how we show the world that what we're saying is true about God and that we are his. John 18:36, Jesus answered Pilate, saying, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here. So just to have this verse in here, because it says, this is Jesus saying, my servants, meaning, and he's talking to Pilate, so in this context, his servants are likely his disciples, the 12 disciples, and maybe generally speaking, those who followed him. But mainly his disciples. He says, if my kingdom was of the world, then my servants, my disciples, would be fighting like soldiers. But they're not, because my kingdom isn't here, and they don't have to defend it here. And so I think that this is interesting and helpful for us. We do have to realize that we aren't defending Christ's kingdom here with bloodshed, because it's not important. That's not the nature of his kingdom. His kingdom will be after this material life, these flesh bodies with blood. And so the shedding of blood in battle for the kingdom of Christ doesn't make sense. And Christ states that here when he's talking to Pilate. Now, I think that's what's another story that's pertinent too. We've kind of gone through Jesus' teachings, and I think in the case of smiting on the cheek, we've found, the turning the other cheek and the smiting of the cheek, we see that that's not like all-out physical violence. It's this idea of someone slandering you or slighting you or slapping you in the face, something humiliating that's not necessarily like injurious, but that it was the intended meaning, and that meaning is not only where Christ said it, but it's in the Old Testament. So we have corroborating evidence that that's what it meant. And so in the case of that, it sounds like it's not quite as serious an offense. It's not like someone's coming after you with an axe to kill you and you're going to turn the cheek and allow him. That's not what Jesus was saying. He was saying, if the guy next door down the street gets mad at you, comes up to you, yells at you in front of everybody, tries to make a mockery of you, calls you names, slaps you in the face, insults you, that you should take it and turn the other cheek or walk away. That the insults can be diffused, and that it's not appropriate to exact vengeance in that case. And it also isn't helpful for anybody. And I think that's what Christ is saying. And then in the case of loving your enemies, he does give us examples, loving your enemies, he gives us examples of blessing them that curse you, pray for them, do good to those that hate you. But, again, these examples aren't of if your neighbor's trying to kill you or hurt your family or, destroying your livestock, like your livelihood, essentially. Those things it doesn't seem to be what Christ focused on here. It seems to be more about the day-to-day dealings of people with people where someone's trying to make someone else look bad or hurt them in a non-physical manner and do evil things to get them, right? And then in the case of, an eye for an eye, he's saying, that's the way it was in the Old Testament. But I'm telling you, in most cases, in the cases of insult, in the cases of someone slighting you or taking from you, stuff it's not like murder. It's not like super physical violence or anything like that, but you can diffuse it by turning the other cheek, not getting vengeance, because vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. So then I wanted to get to, now that we've gone through those, some of these stories where Jesus comes in contact, or the disciples come in contact with someone who is a soldier. So someone whose job is to fight for a possibly good, possibly corrupt leader, possibly corrupt kings, possibly a corrupt military force, and asked to do things that might be considered atrocious. What about a soldier who his job is to follow the orders and possibly kill, maim, destroy, And so what does Jesus say to these types of guys when he comes into contact with them? So one is the centurion in Matthew chapter 8, verse 5. And Jesus comes into contact with this centurion. It says, and when Jesus entered Capernaum, there came to him a centurion beseeching him and saying, Lord, my servant lies at home sick of palsy and grievously tormented. Jesus says to him, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but speak only the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this man, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled, and he said to them that followed, Verily I say to you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. And I say to you that many shall come from the east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the children of the kingdom shall be cast into outer darkness. He's talking about the Jews there. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, Go thy way, thou hast believed, so be it done unto thee. And his servant was healed that selfsame hour. So, I read through that quick, but in all of that writing, and a centurion is a Roman warrior. And this guy was high ranking because he says he has soldiers under him. And so he was able to command them and tell them to go and do this and that. And he even gives that example to Christ. He's like, you don't have to go to my servant to heal him. You just say the word, and I know because you have authority as given to you by God, that if you say it, it will be done. Just as when I say things to my soldiers, it will be done. And so Jesus says, I haven't found quite that great a faith in all of Israel at this point. And so, but the one thing we don't hear him say is, put down your sword, put down your shield, walk away from the army that you're in, the military you're in, and live a life of kindness and peace with all your fellow men. All right? So, I'm not saying that maybe Jesus wouldn't say that to this man if, the man sat and studied under Jesus and spent time with him, which he may have. He may have followed Jesus around the countryside for a while. Who knows? But in this encounter, we don't see Jesus calling this guy out for being a soldier of death and one who commands others to do the same. And we know the Roman armies were notorious for killing indiscriminately those who wouldn't bow to Caesars, wouldn't do this, wouldn't do that, wouldn't look at them crossways. They would kill them or do other things. And so it's just an interesting note. It's not a proof that Jesus condoned his behavior, but it's interesting that Jesus didn't call him out. So let's go on to another one. In Luke chapter 3, verse 14, John the Baptist doesn't tell these soldiers that he runs across to leave their army either. It says, and the soldiers likewise demanded of him, John the Baptist, saying, What shall we do? And he said to them, Do not physically intimidate any man or accuse any man falsely, and be content with your wages. So he obviously doesn't tell him. And so let me help with this. He tells them, be content with your pay for your being a soldier. He tells them, don't accuse anyone falsely or intimidate anyone because you're a soldier. Don't use your strength and your weapons or whatever to intimidate and extort from others. And that's what this word, if you look up the intimidate word, and I think other translations have it a little different. Let me look real quick. Luke chapter 3, 14. Yeah, it says here, if you look at the translation, it'll say, do violence to no man. But if you look at the word under violence in the Greek, it is a word that means intimidate. It means extort. In the case of some of the Bible scholars who've looked at that word, but it does not necessarily mean violence. In fact, that's not in most of the definitions I saw of that Greek word. So it truly is talking about, he's saying to these guys, just as is in my notes, he's saying, don't intimidate anybody. Don't use your soldier mannerisms against people, to extort money from them. Don't accuse anyone falsely, and be content with the wages you're paid. So all that kind of fits together when you understand what it's talking about. But this is what he said, and he didn't say, leave the army. He says, be happy with what you're paid there, and then do good as you're in the army. Don't use it against people. Because, the Roman soldiers were notorious for doing that. They get a wild hair, they go into someone's home and say, hey, we demand the tax for Caesar. And if the people didn't give it to them, they would beat them or, rape women and do things like that. So this is what John the Baptist is saying to these soldiers. And he doesn't tell them, leave the army, drop your sword and your shield and walk away. They'd probably be beheaded if they did anyway. So just to note. Now, another instance of violence that I just wanted to at least talk about, Peter cuts off Malchus's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane, and note that Jesus doesn't chastise him for violence when he does it. Luke chapter 22, verse 49, and I kind of spliced Luke and John's accounts together because each of them doesn't get the whole picture, like they leave out a name or something that happened. So I spliced them together so you get the story in sequence. It says, when they which were about him saw what would follow, they said to him, and this is the disciples, Lord, shall we smite with the sword? This is as the soldiers had come up. And Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then Jesus said to Peter, put up thy sword in the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? And Jesus answered and said, suffer ye thus far. And he touched his ear and healed him. So the soldiers surround Jesus in the garden. The disciples get agitated. They say, what should we do? Peter pulls his sword and cuts off the ear of Malchus. And then Jesus says, wait, what are you doing, Peter? But then the next thing he says is important. He doesn't say, I have taught you to never be violent. And so why do you offend me with disobedience? He doesn't say that. Jesus instead says, shall I not drink the cup which my Father hath given me? Right there. He says, put up your sword. I have to do this. So it's interesting that Christ focuses nowhere near the violence that Peter has just exacted on Malchus. He instead is 100% solely focused on that I need to do what my Father has given me to do, and you're trying to prevent it. Stop. And so it just is interesting that in all these cases we keep going to, that Jesus nor his apostles call people out for these acts of seeming violence in the Scripture. It's not a condoning, but it's definitely not a calling out. And they didn't seem to have a problem with these guys who were military men. And so we just need to take all these things into account as we consider this topic. Note this too, in Old Testament law, I looked at murder and killing. I've talked to a lot of people that have a huge problem with murder and killing. They think any time anyone's killed, it's murder. But that's not true. The word murder has a specific meaning in law and in life, and it is a specific type of killing. And so you can't say that all killing is murder. That's wrong. You don't understand the words if you say that. So the Old Testament law is looking at to see what does it really say about killing or murder or that type of thing. It says, do not forbid killing in self-defense or in battle. It doesn't forbid that. If you are attacked and you kill someone, you are in the clear as far as Old Testament law is concerned. If you are in a war and you kill someone, you are in the clear. That's not murder. And so the Old Testament law, people were clear against this stuff. The armies of Joshua went through and obeyed God by killing and slaughtering other nations of people as they went through the promised land, Canaan. And that's a whole nother topic all to itself that I want to do at some point. But In Exodus 2:14, Moses slays the Egyptian for beating another Hebrew. So he's trying to protect this other Hebrew in self-defense, or not self-defense, but in defense of him, and he kills the Egyptian. And the Mosaic law would have protected him in this case. He's okay, because he was trying to save another man's life. Exodus chapter 23, verse 7, and the innocent and righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. So now this is saying, do not slay the innocent. Do not slay the righteous. So there is, murder is like a premeditated killing of someone who has done nothing wrong and is not a threat, right? And this is kind of echoing that in Exodus 23:7. And it's interesting, too, that I found that the defense of others, coming to someone else's aid, was required by Levitical law. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. And that means if you see someone being hurt or killed or whatever, it is your job, your duty to defend them. And if you don't, you can be prosecuted. I sometimes wish our laws were like that. If you stand idly by while someone is beaten or killed or maimed, then you are culpable as well as the murderer or the perpetrator. In the Gemara, Sanhedrin 73a, it teaches, from where do we know that if you see someone drowning, being mauled by beasts or attacked by thieves, that you must save him? It says, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. So Leviticus 19:16, which we read, the Sanhedrin Gemara, the Talmud, and the Torah, the teachings of the Jews pointed at that verse, and they were like, that requires you to not stand by when someone is being attacked or hurt or killed. Or even it says drowning or being attacked by animals or thieves or humans or whatever. Your job as a fellow Israelite, in the case of the Old Testament law, is to save that person. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. So that makes me think, in the case of these things, this topic always brings up the idea and the talk about protecting your family. Is it okay to protect your family if you have to do violence to protect your family, to save them, or something like that? And one thing I did think of, apart from this Leviticus 19:16, which seems to say you are definitely justified. In fact, it's your duty to save your fellow man, including your family, from harm if someone is trying to do harm to them or kill them or hurt them. But apart from that, I thought of, the family, your family particularly. God gives us an idea of why we have family and what the family is a picture of. And that's in Ephesians 5:25. He's talking about husbands and wives. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife. The two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself, and a wife sees that she reverences her husband. So in the loving of a man and a woman in a husband-wife relationship, they should emulate and paint a picture to the world of God loving the church. And if that's the case, what did God do for the church? Well, he sent his son, sacrificed to save the church. He protected the Israelites in the Old Testament many times by helping them win war and victory over battles and evil nations and evil people, wicked, trying to do harm to them, kill them. And so this to me is God is our Father, and the father of a family must protect his own. God protected Israel from the Egyptians by sending plagues, by killing their firstborn, by drowning the Egyptian army in the sea when they were trying to follow and kill the Israelites. And this was after the Egyptians had kept them in bondage for hundreds of years. It's not like the Egyptians were innocent, right? As those other verses said. This was after they had been kept in bondage for hundreds of years. The Egyptians had killed many of them from harsh labor and small provisions. And the Pharaoh himself had killed all the firstborn males in the land of the Hebrews by his decree. So, God avenged them, but know that God, if God is the father of the family of Christ, of the church, and he was the protector of Israel as their father, then how much more should the father of a family be the protector of his family, of his wife, his children, just as the model given in the scriptures? And so, to me, this gives us a good idea of how we should stand against others who try to come against and hurt and destroy our families as men. And in general, that coupled with the Levitical teachings about not standing idly by when someone is attacked, seems like you have every right and responsibility to protect your families in whatever way is necessary to stop a threat to your family. All right? I think that's pretty clear. I'm not going to get graphic, but I will say if anyone comes against my family in any way like that, that I will not stop until that threat is no longer there. Whatever that takes. It'll be hard, but I will not stop until I have successfully protected my family from that threat. And God is my model there, and I think that teaching is clear. Why is being a soldier in an army seem to be okay with Christ? Okay, so we already went through that. I think these are the ends of my notes, and some arguments from pacifists, and I don't want to go into that stuff. There's not much there, but we've gone through the main stuff, and I think it's pretty clear from what we've seen that yes, Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, that we as Christians are supposed to turn the other cheek. If someone slaps us, if someone insults us, if someone puts us down in front of others, if someone calls our names in the marketplace and says we are horrible, horrible, wicked people, that we don't retaliate and say that person's horrible and wicked, or we don't slap their face, or we don't call them names. And so that's what Jesus Christ was talking about. He does say, love your enemies. It's like heaping coals on their head if you can love your enemy. Paul echoes that and says, if you can, live peaceably with all men. But Christ is saying, if at all possible, if you can show love to your enemies, it will turn their hearts. It will change their hearts. And so that's what we should do, if at all possible. But we are within our rights, and we are justified in and have a duty to protect others that we are responsible for, and others just in general. And we are justified in self-defense according to the law. Jesus didn't teach. He wasn't teaching about. He was teaching about you at a personal level with your enemy. He's not talking about wars, and he's not talking about battles. He was talking about people to people. You and your brother, you and your neighbor, you and the guy in the market, you and the guy down the street. If he's an enemy, try to love him. Show him what love is. But if he comes at you with an axe to cut your head off, or to cut off the head of your wife or child, or your neighbor that you love, your brother, then you stop him, whatever that takes. I don't think Jesus would have argued with that. I don't think he... I just don't see the I don't see the complete pacifist. I don't see that teaching being something that was in the scriptures. But I could be wrong. I could be wrong. This is not a cut and dry, obviously, completely cut and dry topic in the scriptures. And so, I'm open to ideas. I think every person has to kind of think about this and figure it out for himself. It's a little difficult with Scripture to know exactly, but I think if Christ had wanted to say, I approach Scripture this way a lot. You kind of have to ask yourself, like, well, so I have an interpretation of the Scripture, and if Christ wanted to say it the way I think it is supposed to be, would he have just said it another way? Because would that have just been easier? And I think in this case, if he had meant you are supposed to be so pacifistic that you shouldn't ever do anything to exact violence on another person, even if they are raping your wife and stealing your children and trying to kill you, that you should stand idly by and lift your head to heaven and say a prayer while they slice your throat. I don't think Christ meant that, because he didn't say it. He could have said that in 100,000 different words, but he never did, and neither did any of the apostles. Because I think they all had an intrinsic knowledge of the Old Testament law, and that those things were perfectly justified under the law. Self-defense, defending others against evil wickedness and harm, that was appropriate. And they knew it in that time period. Christ knew it because he knew the law inside and out, and all the disciples knew it. And if the disciples had had a question on that, they, having memorized the Old Testament, unlike us in the modern times, they memorized the Old Testament, the Torah, and much of the Psalms and everything. They would have asked Christ, well, Christ, what about in the case of someone who's trying to harm your family? Are you allowed then to raise up arms against them? If someone is trying to murder you, do you have a right to fight back, or did you mean we should just stand by and let them kill us? I think the disciples probably would have had that question if they thought that was even something that Christ meant, but I don't think he did. And I think that that's why we don't see that discussion anywhere in the New Testament from any of the disciples or any of the apostles at all. But we do see trying to love your enemies, trying to live peaceably, and we see a model in the household with the family of trying to emulate what God did with his children. And that is protect them, look out for them, and if need be, defend them. And so I think that's all I've got. You can put your comments. I'm sure there will be lots of comments on this one. Everybody seems to really have a lot to say about this, and that's fine. I want and would hope that everyone wrestles with this idea on their own and as well as they can, and just does what they feel is right according to God and what God's telling them to do. So God bless you in that search and that study, and have a great week.